You're listening to the EdTech Startup Show, and I'm your host, Gerard Dawson. Today, my guest is Austen Allred, the CEO of Lambda School. And Lambda School is a computer science education that doesn't require students to pay tuition until you get a job. So, unlike traditional computer science degree where students have to pay thousands of dollars or take out a ton of debt, with Lambda School, they kind of change the incentives and give people cool opportunities to better their lives and get a good education. So, Austen, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sure. So, like I mentioned to you before, I'm excited to talk to you for a couple reasons. One is a lot of my experience and conversations are in the K12 world, but I think there's a lot to learn from people like you and other guests I've had on, like Ruben Harris from Career Karma, who are looking at the future of work and education of adults, and how we can maybe apply what you're learning there to how we educate kids too. So just as a little context for you and for listeners. So um, just to kick things off, I'm wondering, for listeners who aren't familiar, can you give a little more context about Lambda School and what you're doing there?
Yeah, so at a high level, we train people to be software engineers and data scientists in live online classes. And Lambda School is unique for a few reasons. The main is that for students, you don't pay tuition until you land a job in the field that you studied, making more than $50,000 a year. So we basically assume the risk of each student getting hired, and we kind of manage all the financing. We use an instrument called an income share agreement. So you pay us a percentage of your salary for a couple of years, up to $30,000 once you're hired. And if you don't get hired, then after 5 years, the agreement goes away and you owe nothing.
Yeah, and so as a high school teacher, I've seen so many kids who are like 17, 18 making these big decisions about their educations and, you know, financial decisions without maybe fully understanding the implications of those. So I'm really curious to dive into your model a little more. Um, First, though, right now we're in October 2020, and in America, you mentioned live online learning, and now really quickly that's what many children are doing too for the first time. And
Yeah.
you didn't start during the pandemic. Have been around, of course, before that. So you've had experience to kind of learn about and develop effective online learning. So I'm curious if you can walk us through a little bit the actual instructional model that you use, and then also, what you've learned along the way about making that work.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yeah, you're right. So we started in 2017, and at the time, people generally thought of online learning was kind of a MOOC and a bunch of pre-recorded videos or some, software-driven thing, um, or it was in person. And there wasn't very much live online interactive learning happening. And of course, coronavirus kind of forced us into a situation where that's very much not the case today. Um, but the broad narrative at the time was basically that online learning doesn't work very well. And I think that's largely a result of when people said online learning, they meant, here's a bunch of videos, good luck. And I agree that that doesn't work well. So I think the big difference between online learning and in-person learning is there's a lot of subtle information that you can gain from the interaction layer of just watching people. So you can look at their faces and see how confused they are. You can um, see if they're paying attention. And I noticed a big difference between high school and college when the you had a computer and half of the class would be on Facebook. So there are a couple things to think about in an online environment. One is you can't see faces as easily, so you have to build other feedback loops so you can see how students are doing. And the other is everybody is one click away from Netflix at any given time, or Facebook, or Twitter, or YouTube, or TikTok, or whatever. So you have to be holding a student's attention is more difficult and more important. And I can only imagine what that's like for, I mean, my daughter's preschool moved to Zoom, and that fundamentally didn't work. Um, but I can only imagine if you're trying to teach 17-year-olds online, that's rough. That's like, that's, no, it's hard enough to get 17-year-olds to pay attention if you're standing right in front of them, let alone if they're, you know, looking into a computer screen.
Mhm. Um, just to touch on that for a moment, is maybe a dumb question, but I actually like to ask those. Is motivation an issue for Lambda School students when they have a financial incentive to complete things?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably less of an issue for us than it would be for, a public school teacher, because every student willfully chose to be there, right? And I'm sure the K-12 teachers would attest that that's half the battle, is that some students just fundamentally don't care to be there. And you can lead a horse to water, et cetera, et cetera. But still, for us, there's a big delta between what a person wishes that they would want to do and what they actually want to do. So there's some of it that's reminding them, hey, this is why you're here. It's going to be really hard. Some of it is building in the accountability. And then some of it is just trying to, like, I think the most important aspect of an online lecture is how long do you go before the student has to do something. So whether that's fill out a poll that you can see the response of, or whether, we generally don't think of our instruction as a lecture. We think of it as a guided project. So we're building a project together. And we use IY loops, which, depending on who you're talking to, is either really, really old and boring or kind of interesting. But the I do, we do, you do loop, where an instructor will do something, then the instructor will do something along with the student, and then we'll break into breakout rooms, and the student will do something with the instructor kind of watching over your shoulder. And that's one unique thing, that's actually really powerful about doing everything online, is you can instantly subdivide the class from 100 people into groups of 2, into groups of 4, and you can move in and out of those, with relative ease. So that's interesting, because that's definitely not true in a normal classroom.
Yeah, it's cool to hear you mention the I do, we do, you do, or sometimes called gradual release.
Yep.
Because that's foundational structure of a lesson, which it's interesting to see even at what I would consider in Lambda School the cutting edge of education. It's still this a fundamental structure that, with a lot of of course variation built in, like you said, with group size and accountability measures, etc.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamentals of instructional design don't change, right? The environment and the circumstances under which you perform, the instructional design, so your assessment model is going to look very similar in an online school as it would in an offline school. You may need to assess in a different way or with a different frequency, but the fundamentals of how do you, help somebody understand where they are, where they need to go, and what they need to do to get there is still very much the same. The fundamentals and the research all apply.
Yeah, just to little quick aside, and I can cut this part out if you're not comfortable talking about it. But I also have my son was in preschool in the spring, and I saw also how it was hilarious to observe from 6 feet away, but it wasn't the meaningful interactions and kind of wholesome learning that can happen in a in-person preschool environment.
For sure.
To no discredit of the teachers whatsoever, but I'm curious if uh, everything you're seeing in education in 2020, both professionally for you, and then maybe as just an observer of seeing what's in the news, and maybe increases in homeschool and things like that. What's your take on education for your own kids, your own family?
Yeah, I mean, we go back and forth all the time. So I've also, been lucky to be surrounded by some basically rich people, for lack of a better way to describe it, who have created their own homeschool, private school type curriculum. So I was talking to one investor, and he kind of introduced me to his son, who was like 13 or 14 or something like that. And he'd spent his entire life, like he would wake up at 9 a.m. and he would be tutored in chess by a grandmaster who was in Eastern Europe. And then he would do math with a Stanford grad student who was, happy to make $20 an hour, and that's what his dad paid him. And it was, I mean, it struck me how incredible his kid's education was. And of course, his dad was wealthy, and that's kind of one of the prerequisites for that. But I think you can actually structure that to some degree without, it doesn't have to be one-on-one, and you can bring the cost down quite a bit. So there are a few models that I'm really interested in the K-12 homeschooling space. Two of which I have invested in the companies, one of which I have not. So the two that I have invested in, one is called Prenda. Um, and I don't know how controversial charter schools are on your podcast, but they
No,
basically
let it fly.
they basically built a kind of charter school micro school with 8 kids that go meet up at one of the kids' houses or the teacher's house. Um, and the fast, they've built all the curriculum, so it's easier for the teacher, and the students can vary in age group. So it's pretty different than what a traditional public school is. But what's fascinating there is, they don't have all the resources. So they don't have a nurse on staff, they don't have special needs facilities, et cetera, et cetera. But for those students, the cost per student is a tiny fraction of what the cost per student would be in a public school system. And the teachers are all getting paid more. Um, so I'm pretty fascinated by that. And then the other model that I find interesting is there's two companies. One is called Primer, and Primer is basically, they're building all of the curriculum and all of the instruction and all of that for your kids, so you don't have to. It is kind of crazy if you think about it, that basically all of the teachers wake up in the morning and they're all teaching the same thing, and they're all preparing different lessons, thousands and thousands at a time. And we've seen companies like Teachers Pay Teachers kind of capitalize that a little bit. But if you're to extrapolate that out, maybe we may get to a world where there's one really, really incredible teacher who prepares one just jaw-dropping, amazing lesson, and then the other teachers are there to help facilitate students in learning that lesson. That hasn't happened yet, but that is super interesting. Just the centralization of expertise, and how much is centralized versus how much is decentralized. I think that's a question that we're starting to answer again for the first time, because we're recognizing that even if there is a parent full-time to homeschool a kid, that's a tough job. I mean, my wife was a third grade teacher, and she worked really long hours for really low pay. And I don't think you can expect every parent in the United States to do that, and it doesn't make sense to. Um, so there are efficiencies to be gained, and there are models to be tweaked, and I'm really curious to see where it all ends up.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting how the you mentioned that the model. I've thought about that too. Thousands, millions of teachers developing lessons, and if you think about, let's say, basically teaching has kind of resisted the power curve, the power law, or like having uh, so I'm failing to find the correct statistical term, but with the best rising to the top, the Pareto principle type idea, where
Yeah.
there's so much repetition that could be, like you said, worked out to have the best lessons, or at least the best people to deliver the lessons, like you're saying, and then have parents or teachers who support or counsel. Um, so that's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
at a lower level, it's even, or a more micro level, it's even interesting that, my wife, when she was through her part of her first year of teaching, she finally got together with some of the other teachers and said, "All right, we're all teaching third grade. We all have the same core curriculum. Why don't we like rotate and share some of the curriculum development process?" And of course, that's when she was new, so she didn't. Some of the teachers have a year. They've had their lessons for 15 years and they haven't had to change, or they make little tweaks here and there. Um, but that's really interesting to me, just the way that developed. And I agreed. One of the interesting things is how little automation or you know mass information has played a role in education. It's a little bit surprising.
yeah, there are some factors like you mentioned, special needs, or the fact
For
that we
sure.
have a state by state uh, education system. So there's more or less 50 different sets of standards. But I think, even though it's been one of the last to hold out, I think, all of the good parts of you know, network effects and things like that will eventually we see them beginning to tap into childhood education too.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think part of the reality of it is, I mean, I only know how it has been in the districts where my wife taught, or the districts where my kids have been in school. Um, but the K12, startup landscape is just ruined with corpses of companies that tried to sell to school districts, and school districts don't want to buy anything. Like the fact that the best monetization model that stuff like teachers pay teachers or Remind or some of the best ed tech companies start with is coming out of the teacher's own pocket is just wild. Like that's I mean, to anybody in startup land, that's crazy. I would never even buy my own laptop, let alone, you know, buy anything else that I need to do out of my own salary. And the startup salary is like way higher than a teacher salary. So I think that is probably the fundamental point, is like the money has to come from somewhere in order for somebody to innovate, and the districts aren't going to pay for it. Yeah, it's the choices that some districts make are very interesting and not exactly the ones that I make. Where, my wife, when she was teaching third grade, every kid had an iPad, but she couldn't get like enough paper to like do all of her assignments. All their assignments were like, you know, 2 by 2, double sided, and all the kids had an iPad that sat there all day because they didn't use it. Um, but that's another topic of conversation altogether.
yeah, sure. Yeah, right. Funding and all that. Yeah, that's a whole tangled web. Um,
Yes.
but something, maybe you've been asked this before. I couldn't quite find an answer. I've tried to do my research. Um, if we start, I was talking about recently with some other people in education of how I thought, like, even if you think about our conversation today, the education kind of innovates at the end points. So like early childhood education and then workforce, and then it kind of is working towards the middle. So, we see lots of schools, for example, in cities have given free preschool because we realize, okay, that's has a big is a big lever. And then, of course, things that are related to the workforce, like Lambda School, that's a place for innovation. But I can see, as Lambda School succeeds and have so many success stories that I'd like to talk about during our conversation too. Then that's when gradually the information flow kind of begins to come down, and I could see the next area being like the end of high school, where people could begin to at least consider that there's other options. And we see things like, the gap year, for example, uh,
Yeah.
getting more prominence. So a long intro, but I'm curious of what you think about could be ways that Lambda School, ISAs, et cetera, could begin to affect, a 16 to 18-year-old's life and
Yeah,
education?
yeah, it's a really good question. So ISAs, I don't know if they'll play a big role in 16 to 18-year-old. Partially because that's just a really young age to be entering into. I mean, it's not legal to enter into legal contracts without your parents' consent generally.
Good
And
point.
it's
I
also
guess,
a funny.
sorry to clarify, just like considering that as an option post
Oh,
graduation.
for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, what I think is going to be really interesting is, I mean, for a long time, there has been a single track to success in the United States, and that is, do well in high school, go to the best college you can, pay whatever it costs, doesn't matter, and then you'll go to a big corporation and you'll work your way up, and no one's going to look at you if you don't have a college degree, and the better your college degree is, the more people look at you. Um, and so I think you're right in that it's starting to break down at the employment level, where the number of people who are getting the degree that was promised to come with a good job and are not getting a good job is increasing rapidly. And the number of people able to get good jobs without the credentials is also increasing rapidly. So you slowly watch that cascade down to where, well, if I don't need to go to college, if I don't need to go to the best state school in my region and get really good grades to get that same job, if that's the reason I was going to that school, which of course isn't the only reason people go to university, then maybe there's an alternate path that I would take. So maybe I mean, for a lot of students, Lambda School is after college. For some of them, it's before. For some of them, it's instead of. Um, and then a lot of high school, I mean, if you were to ask the average high school guidance counselor what their goal is for their students, I'm sure the answer would be getting them to good colleges, right? Um, and then the middle school teacher or junior high teacher might be, I need to prepare my students to do well in high school so they can get into a good college. So those ripple effects kind of start to cascade down. In the K-12 world, or in kind of grades 9 through 12, I suspect that we'll start to see more alternative high schooling experiences and more what I would call apprenticeship type models. So we had that at my school where you could be a CNA for half the day, or you could go work with an auto mechanic for half the day. But that was generally speaking seen as like a blue collar thing for someone who is not going to go to college, which I don't think is right or healthy, but that's how it was perceived. Um, I think we might enter into a world where, in places like Germany, you can pick whether you want to go to a more vocational school or a more academic school, and both of those are viewed the exact same way. They're totally fine, and you start some of them earlier. You start engineering school in some instances when you're 16, because you kind of know you want to go down that path. Um, so I think we could see more and more of that creeping into where high school becomes less generalized and more apprenticeship based. Um, but where it's happening today is still a tiny, tiny fraction of the total student body.
Yeah, it's always interesting because those blue collar jobs, one, they're always in demand, the trades especially, and they, if you compare it to, like, happy to throw myself under the bus. I had an English degree, and if you go work at like an entry level PR job or something, compared to if you go become an electrician, your
Yeah,
path to
it's cutthroat. Yeah.
yeah, and the starting salary, for example, you can make a lot of money fast with those trades. Um, so jumping back over to your company, you talked a little bit about the model, but I'm curious also about the individuals, like the teachers, teaching assistants, or the people with other roles in Lambda School. What makes a good instructor that you've seen, and how do you try to basically scale or replicate that process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we've kind of subdivided the role of a teacher into, I mean, we have enough students that we can and there are few enough subjects that we can kind of specialize a little bit. So we have one role that we call the subject matter expert. And so that is someone who has been working in the industry for 15, 20 years. They know the technology backwards and forwards. Um, and they are super expensive, especially in software, because if you are a subject matter expert in software engineering, you can go work at Google and make really good money. Um, and they don't actually have to be good teachers or know anything about instructional design. So they're just the subject matter experts. Then we have the curriculum developer. And the curriculum developer, their strength is instructional design, and they need to know much less about the technology side of things. They're kind of helping the subject matter expert organize his thoughts into something that is a usable curriculum. And then we have the instructor, and we actually like instructors to be someone with the more experience in education or in the practice of teaching, the better. And they certainly have to have familiarity with the topics that they're teaching, but they don't have to be as advanced as a subject matter expert. Um, First of all, because there just aren't enough subject matter experts to go around, and they're all too expensive, and we don't want to charge our students $80,000 a year. Um, but also because we've actually found in a lot of instances it's better if the student learned relatively recently, so within the last 3 to 5 years, how to do what they do, because then they remember what it's like to be a beginner. They remember, you know, the equivalent might be if you have someone who's 25 teaching high school versus someone who's 50 teaching high school. There's just a different level of resonance there. I don't know if that's the perfect model, but that's what we've seen working really well for us, and we're constantly tweaking, what that is. But yeah, I think it works really well. So the ability to distribute those things out and specialize a little bit, because at a high level, the notion that you'll be able to find someone with 15 years of experience who has experience in education and recently learned to do the things so they can empathize with the student better literally doesn't exist. So you have to pick two of the three, and so yeah, we're trying to figure that out, but I think our model now works relatively well.
Yeah, that's that makes sense on how to break it down. And I'm curious then, I've heard one of the arguments against, I guess, getting a computer science degree from from a university in terms of the perspective is that computer science, the best practice like front end languages, for example, are always changing and there's always new frameworks and stuff. So is curriculum development just a never ending process for you basically? How do you deal with those changes?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. If it doesn't happen, it happens quickly, for more quickly than the university cycle is ready to prepare. Like if you're a philosophy professor, you never change your curriculum, right? So the notion that a professor would need to change their curriculum, or totally rewrite it every year or two feels crazy in a higher ed environment. But for us, that's not crazy at all. In fact, it's a little slow. We could move faster if we needed to.
Mhm.
But then certainly there are the principles of computing, like the fundamentals of how computers work and how we talk to them, and how binary works and stuff like that. That will never change. And so the fundamentals will still be there, and we make sure that we teach those fundamentals. So yeah, it depends on what you're looking at. The argument of the computer science professor is, well, I'm going to teach them fundamentals well enough that they can pick up whatever the newfangled technology is, and so it's not an issue. And our argument is kind of, well, let's just do both. Like we can teach computer science fundamentals and give you the most up-to-date software and use the most in industry tools, and like that doesn't have to be one or the other.
Right. So you get the person as basically, at least what I've seen, like as close as possible to just jump directly into their new role, often like a life changing new job for them. Um,
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you definitely, our students still have to be able to learn on their own. So I think one of the issues was with code boot camps of old is they taught you the newest stuff and you could get your first job, but then your career would plateau because you didn't know how to learn the next thing. Um, and then employers are frustrated hiring computer science students because they know the fundamentals, but you have to teach them how to build stuff. Um, so our approach was, well, I don't think we have to take one side or the other there. We can just do both. We don't have to pick compromises. And then we're going to work with the employers to get you your first job, and hopefully you're set up for the rest of your career as well.
Yeah. Um, so going in, kind of diving a little more into, what somebody learns when they're going through Lambda School. Another interesting thing to me is just the I guess the intensity of the program, right? So if you go to lambdaschool.com/curriculum, it's a pretty cool page to check out. And so if you're full time, you do a warm up from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. and then there's all different things, and then basically you have a meeting at the end, going until 5 o'clock. So it's more or less like 9 hours a day, and it's Monday through Friday, um, and it's how many months is it? Sorry, I forget how many months.
It varies based on track and a few other things, but call it
Mhm.
6 to 9 months full time.
Mhm. Yeah. So um, I'm curious if, I know there's a social aspect, of course, of people going through a challenging situation together with a similar goal. Um, can you talk a little bit about that and any other supports you've built in or noticed that help people keep up, basically?
Yeah, so the fundamental trade-off that we're making is we want to teach students for long enough that they can learn everything that they need to learn. So we've to some extent condensed what you would get in a computer, you're really learning over 2 years of computer science, and there's 6 months of breaks for summer. So, it's pretty close to one hour for hour with a computer science degree, depending on which university you go to and how long you spend studying outside of that. Um, but for a lot of our students, like finding 6 or 9 months without income is really hard. And so that's the fundamental battle that we face is less around, if we had 4 years of every student working like they would in a CS degree, our students would be absolutely better than anyone else, no questions asked. And there may be a way for us to enable that in the future, which is one of the things I'm working on. Um, but in the meantime, we have to deal with very practical realities that going that long without income is really hard. So it's a constant trade-off that we're battling and testing and trying to figure out, you know, how fast can we get your learning in? Um, how much burnout are you facing? How difficult is it? And so we do a lot of things to support that. We try to find part-time roles for students where available to help them pay the bills. We even we provide mental health services for our students. We've partnered with a company that does that, and we cover it all. So things like counseling and therapy and stuff like that. We provide to some extent. It's not going to replace a full-time therapy session every day, but so yeah, we try to do a lot there, and at the end of the day it is difficult, right? It's hard, and the average student will tell you it's one of the more difficult things they've ever done, and then we kind of think that's okay or unavoidable at best. So it's part of the Lambda School experience is it's going to be really hard and challenging, and it's going to tax you.
Right. And if you're looking at what the change is, right, like a total career change in let's say a year or so, of course that's going to have to be an extreme or intense experience. So that makes sense. Um, since you mentioned, like one of the things you're working on is a different approach or like a different structure. I'm curious otherwise how you think about growing Lambda School, and in terms of it could be, of course, like more of the same, more students. But then I know that people always talk about Lambda School for X. I'm sure you're sick of hearing that concept. But yeah, how do you, just open ended, how do you think about growing Lambda School?
Yeah, I mean, so there are kind of three dimensions along which we can grow. One is more students. One is kind of more tracks within, we'll call it computer science or within software. And then one is kind of tracks or fields outside of software. Frankly, we're still making the business model work within software, within data science and web development. So we're not profitable yet, and if we expanded too quickly, there's a real chance that none of them would work, and we would try 15 things, and so we definitely need to get software there, and there's a lot involved in that. From how do we select the right students who are going to be successful, to how do we train them the right way, how do we have the right amount of scalable employer partnerships on the other side so that our students get hired. How do we get around credential gaps that our students have and convince employers that they should take a look at these students. And all of that kind of has to work very seamlessly and very, very effectively in order for just the software piece to work. And then there are a lot of learnings that we're going to take from the software side into other fields. But there's also going to be a lot of learning and a lot of stuff that's different. So people ask me all the time, what do you think about, Lambda School for X? And I always say, go for it. Just know it's really hard. Like there's a reason schools haven't taken on the risk of their students up until now, and that's because, I mean, when we first started, um, I would go talk to other schools, and they would say, okay, you're crazy to do something that's free up front because that doesn't work. Also, you're crazy to do something that's online because that doesn't work. And they're like, yeah, but we're going to do both of those things together, so it'll work. And they're like, no, you're like, the craziness is compounding.
Mhm.
Um, so, so yeah, I think once we make it work, we will be able to take the learnings and expand them to other fields. And I'm sure other folks will start Lambda School for X or Lambda School in different regions or whatever else along the way. Um, but I think you just have to learn a lot of this stuff the hard way. There's no shortcuts that are going to work, which is good for the students. The good thing is the incentive models that we've started to introduce to vocational schools are those where the most successful, the school that does the best job of preparing their students will win. And that's not been true in the past, and I'm really excited for that to be true. Um, that makes it way more difficult to run a school and way easier to be a student, and I think that's how it should be.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. I like how just through its existence, or through founding the company, there's been a new viewpoint kind of injected into the education environment, which is now that Lambda School and ISAs and like I referred to before, Career Karma, et cetera, companies like that exist. There's a new perspective of, wait, you have to at least pause and consider that there's, as you mentioned, not just the one path, and it may not work because of all these reasons and secondary effects we see in society. So I like how you said it's a really hard company to a concept to execute, but just by trying, there's been a new an elevated conversation about how we do things, which I think is cool.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I honestly believe over the next 20 years, we will be able to pretty much eliminate student debt, or at least the need to take on student debt. We just got so much work to do to get there. So we'll see.
yeah, yeah. Um, so one thing that's cool, maybe for any listeners who haven't checked out Lambda School, is I think Austin, how you share the success stories of your students is cool, and just to see the excitement. I guess you often show like a screenshot of Slack, right? If I'm not mistaken, when
Yeah, that's correct.
people get offers from companies. So I'm sure this could be a big answer, but can you share the kinds of, basically, like stories or impacts that happen with Lambda School when everything works well?
Yeah, so right now we're seeing about 100 students a month get hired for the first time. Um, and the average increase in income per student is about $50,000 a year per student. So and I think the craziest increase in income we've ever seen per student is north of 200K. That does not happen very often. That's crazy. That's more than I make. But yeah, I think the reality is there are students who've decided to kind of take their future into their own hands and take a shot on something. And then when it works, everyone's surprised. So I think some of my favorite stories are, when I'm definitely partial to when there's a single parent trying to do this on their own, because life is difficult as a parent. I can only imagine how difficult it must be as a single parent, and to both be a single parent and turning your life around simultaneously. I just have the utmost respect for the people who are able to do that. Probably my favorite story ever. It's really just like random individuals who, their lives just changed forever, and they're going to make millions of dollars more over the course of their lifetime than they would had they not come to Lambda School. And I love that. But my favorite examples are the ones where there's something that's like very tangible for their family. So one of my favorites was like this guy, called me in tears, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, I've never made more than, our combined salary for the last 2 years between me and my wife was like $20,000 a year, and I just got a $95,000 a year offer. Like, this is gonna change everything." And I was like, "Oh man, that's so awesome." He's like, "No, you don't understand. Like, I just got to go tell my daughter that she gets her own bedroom." And like, that's when you really realize what the impact is, right? The statistics are cool and it's awesome, but it's really about, there's some little girl somewhere who now has a bedroom who wouldn't have otherwise. And to play even a tiny role in that is just really fun.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. And actually, just to tie some things together, I feel like that is totally a common thread with people who start a company in education, regardless of the stage or the age of the person or how you're doing it. Is I think a lot of people have a skeptical view of an education company, like monetizing something and then losing your having distorted reasons for it. But over and over again, I just hear about people who you know are motivated by the impact that they have on people's lives. So that's cool to hear you explain that as well. Um, so I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, Austen. So for people who want to learn more about Lambda School or get in touch with you, what do you want to suggest for listeners to do after they're done listening?
Yeah, lambdaschool.com. Luckily, I think now any way you may be able to misspell that will still come up first. And then I'm Austen on Twitter, Austen, like Jane Austen. Um, yeah, those are probably the best ways.
Awesome. Um, all right, everybody. So until next time, my name's Gerard Dawson. This is the EdTech Startup Show. And Austen, thanks again so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cool. All right.